Hello there, we are the Star Wars guys, and welcome to our YouTube channel. I am Master Paul,
And I am Mando on fire.
and I got this idea for this video today, actually just a couple minutes ago, as sort of, I guess you could say, an epilogue for our series of reviewing every single Star Wars movie. Let's take a moment and rank each Star Wars movie. And so I know this is a dead trend, but let's make a tier list out of every single Star Wars movie, which is what you see we see it on the left of our screens. So we're each going to do our own tier list. Right now, you're seeing Michael's screen, so he's going to go first, and then I'll do mine. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, so let's start things off nice and easy with A New Hope. So it's the first one that started it all, and clearly it set the stage for pretty much everything. So part of me wants to put this on the S stage just because it's the first one. However, it did, of course, have its flaws, and of course we know about how the CGI reshoots were done, which were absolutely terrible if we're being completely honest. So,
Yeah,
well,
it
stuff,
looked like it was from a GameCube or a PS2 game, and not in a good
yeah,
way.
yeah, pretty much. And another thing is that even though there was the first lightsaber duel, it was still a little bit unrefined, but we're gonna give it a little bit of grace on that. So, just based on some of the re-releases, we're gonna put this one at the B slot.
Okay. So, what specifically? I know you mentioned the CGI and the clunky lightsaber fight, but what else? What's keeping it from A tier, and basically, what's keeping it from A tier for you?
So like I said, we shouldn't really be too harsh on this one. So, it was the first one after all, and I guess it was just kind of a couple of things. Like, even though that Mark Hamill was young at the time and probably was supposed to play off the character this way, it seemed like he could. It seems like lines like, "Well, I was supposed to go to the Satoshi station to pick up the power converters," in the way that it did.
Mhm.
It's still kind of
Yep.
it's a little bit cringy. So you really kind of have to nitpick at these sort of things, to be completely honest.
Right.
And
You
we're not gonna,
can't let any sort of nostalgia or bias blind you with this.
yeah, pretty much. So we're pretty much we're so pretty much with that being said, I think that B is a fair option, just because even though it was obviously the first movie, it was by far or not a perfect movie, but it was a very good movie nonetheless.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, so next up, we're going with The Empire Strikes Back. So, well, this is probably debatedly one of probably the best Star Wars movie among the known fandom, I would say. So,
Hmm.
placing this is pretty hard for me, to be completely honest. But I will say that there's a lot of good points on it, and it's really hard for me to find anything really wrong with it. Like, even though that it was re-released back in the 90s and the early 2000s, roughly speaking, it was something that worked. Like, you may have noticed that if you watched the yeah, that if you had watched the original whole shoot as opposed to the remake shoot, you may notice that the Wampa scene where Luke is in the cave was very different. Where in the re-release you saw a fully mobile Wampa as opposed to just a couple of legs walking around. Like, you actually saw the whole thing on
If I
camera
remember
more
correct,
often.
and if I remember correctly, also they hid the true form of the Wampa in the original scene with a lot of fog, right?
So I would say that it's entirely possible. I honestly don't remember, just because for us it's been so long since we've seen the original cuts. But I would say that this one goes to A, just because it has a lot of setup and it does pick up where the original movie left off. Not entirely where it left off, like The Last Jedi did to The Force Awakens, where it literally picked up where it went off. But it was something that you really didn't really mind. And yes, there were a
Okay.
couple of things like I said, it's really hard for me to pinpoint it. Like, you could say, for example, Boba Fett, we really didn't get to see much of him, even though he looks cool. But of course, we can talk about that another time. So I
Right.
would say A is a fair and honest place for The Empire Strikes Back.
Okay. I agree with you.
Yeah. And then next up
Or
on,
rather, I understand where you're coming from. That's yeah.
yeah. All right. So, well, next up on the list, Return of the Jedi. So, this by far, I would say, is actually my favorite from the original trilogy, if I'm being completely honest. And this
Okay.
for me is kind of like A New Hope, but where the original cut was pretty good, but when they redid some of the CGI, it felt weird.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, it wasn't as bad as A New Hope, but it still felt pretty weird. Like
Right.
it had pretty much the same scene, even though it had a different mood. If you know what I mean, like the one with the aliens are dancing.
Right.
So, well, pretty much that's really the only thing I can say that was changed from the original cut.
And
So,
they also added in a different version of the Sarlacc.
oh yeah, the
They added an
Sarlacc.
actual mouth instead of it just being a hole that had tentacles coming out.
Yeah, which of course are stuck around for like the Lego games, Lego sets, and pretty
Right.
much the rest of Star Wars as we know it. So, well, with all that being said, I would, even though that there's like no way to put this at like the in
You
between
can
A and B,
yeah.
I'm gonna put this at B just because there was a little bit of a controversy saying, "Oh wait, the Return of the Jedi was more of a kids thing," which I believe was the directive of the director, so to appeal a little bit more to kids, just because the way I see it, it was the finale of what we knew as the original trilogy, so they wanted as many people to see it. And even though that some people don't like the Ewoks, I don't much mind them myself. I would say that B is a fair place for it.
Okay. Now, real quick before you move on, I do need to ask, are you doing it where since you have New Hope and Last Jedi on the B tier, does that make New Hope ranked slightly higher than Return of the Jedi because it's closer to the left side, or are you just putting it there?
It's pretty much just putting it there. There's no like hierarchy if I were to put it to the left
Okay.
as opposed to the right. They're
Okay.
pretty much just equal.
Yeah. I only ask because that's how some people do it, and that's probably gonna be how I do mine.
Yeah. Okay, so let's keep the trend going to when it was made. Phantom Menace. So I would also say this was another divisive movie. Not as much as some, but we'll get to that later, of course.
Hmm.
But I want to say this was my favorite movie in the prequel trilogy just because it gave us the introduction of Darth Maul, even though that we got just a little bit more, a little bit less screen time. And then we also have the fact that he only says like a couple of lines where he says an entire monologue in some trailer. So that was a little bit of a letdown for me as well.
Right.
And then, of course, we have little Anakin, which honestly, I'm going to be graceful with him just because little Anakin, even though that Jake Floyd didn't turn out so well in the future, I would say that he did his best as little Anakin. Like, what do you expect? He was like playing a 9-year old.
Fair
And 9 year
statement.
olds are going to act like kids. So I'm going to give him a free pass on that. So, and if I remember correctly, this was almost right around the re-releases. So the CGI wasn't great, but it obviously looked better than it did. So
Right. If I remember correctly, the CGI that they did in the re-releases was actually a test that to see what they could do and what they couldn't do in the
yeah,
prequel trilogy coming up, and you could
yeah,
tell.
yeah. And most importantly, it introduced us to the Clankers, and we know how much we like them. So, contrary to popular belief, what we're gonna do is we're actually put this at the A tier, just because for me, it had a lot of it set up the story pretty well for the prequels, and then everything else is pretty obvious. The CGI was pretty good. The fights were pretty good, even though that it left the fandom pretty divisive just because they weren't used to with the Return of the Jedi and Empire Strikes Back fights, when this time the Jedi are actually being more acrobatic.
Right.
All right, so moving on to Attack of the Clones. Now, for Attack of the Clones, this is probably going to be the most memeified one of them all. Like, I'm not even joking. Like, if you have lines like, I don't like sand, it's coarse, it's rough, it's irritating, and it gets everywhere,
If
your
you can't
movie's
tell what
bound
I'm
to
trying to
be,
do with my face, it's visible confusion.
yeah. Like, literally, this movie is a living meme if it was even alive in the first place.
Very true.
So, I'm going to put this at the C tier just because I still like it. I still enjoy it. It introduced us to the Mace Windu Pooper lightsaber that we grow to love. It had the CGI Yoda, but in the end, it just had some bad writing in my opinion. Like I said, I don't like sand, just coarse, rough, it's irritating, all that stuff. But it wasn't a
Yeah.
bad movie, I would say.
Okay.
All right, and now moving on to Revenge of the Sith. So I would almost say this is my favorite movie, but I have to give it to the Phantom Menace. But this was like after the 2D animated Clone Wars, I would say, just because that one was released in 2003 and this was released in 2005. So it did follow through with that storyline pretty well, even though the 2D animated was pretty weird. But getting off topic right here. So this is thought to be the best one among the prequels, just because it shows you the turn from a young Padawan who's dealing with a lot of loss, and this is also a pretty memed up movie as well. So
Hello there.
so, but it's not necessarily bad. So I'm maybe a little bit biased here, but I'm going to put this one at the S tier just because of how,
Okay.
just because of how well it's set up. Pretty much the end of the beginning, if you know what I mean.
Of course.
And then moving on to Rogue One, we're going to take a little bit of a detour. So if you had watched my review on this, or watch our review on it, rather, I said that Rogue One was pretty much the most diverse casting of the entire Star Wars saga, but in the way that it works, where yes, they do look different, and there's a lot of people who have different skin colors. It doesn't matter just because Rogue One doesn't try to make them their identities. And also the story kind of set up, like I said, the beginning, the end of the beginning, or the beginning of the end, rather, or because it's all about a group of rebels trying to steal the Death Star plans. So I'm actually going to put this at the A tier because I love the visuals and I love the practical effects, and I love that there's actual stakes in the mission. And yes, even though some of the stuff was cut from original footage, like you may have noticed in the trailers, I think that it was still a pretty well done movie.
Okay.
And then moving on to Solo, I want to say that this was a pretty divisive film as well. Probably just had fans that didn't really care. I still enjoyed it, but L3 did have her moments, if you know what I mean. If you saw our other video,
Yeah.
where basically she was brought up as an SJW fighting for droids' rights, which wasn't entirely bad, but it was the fact that it was pretty much the purpose of her character and nothing much else to it.
Yeah.
And but it still had a good setup for the Solo story, and it did set up for a possible sequel. So I'm gonna put this at the C tier, just because it wasn't great. It wasn't necessarily terrible. I still had fun with it, but it was pretty. It was a fixer upper. Let's just say that it was a fixer upper. All right, and now for the Force Awakens. So the first movie in the sequel trilogy. So this is my second favorite one. My favorite actually being the Rise of Skywalker, but we'll talk more about that later. So this movie was a good movie because it brought a lot of references to the original trilogy as well as the prequels in some cases. And so, even though it brought up a lot of references, connected a lot of things, and set up a big mystery of like who Rey was or like who Finn was going to be in the trilogy. I would say that this was a pretty good setup, even though that there were some cases where they played it a little bit safe, like when basically they're her trying to blow up another Death Star, or her they find the main character on a desert planet. So there were some things that they definitely played too safe in this movie, but it wasn't enough for me to take away from it actually being a good movie. So for that reason, I would put this at the B tier.
Okay.
And now for The Last Jedi. I may be a little bit biased for doing this, but it's the F tier. Just because it's memed, but it's hated, and it has a very complicated storyline that you really have to pay attention to. It sets up some of the big history, which is good, but ultimately, some characters just got wasted, like Captain Phasma, Luke Skywalker got wasted as well,
Yeah.
and so. Well, for that reason, I'm gonna put this at the F tier. I might be a little bit biased by doing this, but we're doing this, and I don't care. So
Good
now for the
answer.
rise of, Skywalker, which pretty much had to pick up whatever pieces were left over for or the Last Jedi that was left behind. So a lot of things were cleared up in this movie, like who Rey was and pretty much who Finn was, and basically what his role. Even though that his role was definitely disappointing, and Leia's role, even though that they had limited resources, being that Carrie Fisher had passed away, God rest her soul, and then basically it brought back Palpatine, which was good, but they brought him back out of context, basically. Other than a few things like somehow Palpatine returned, or the alluding to Sith cloning or Sith magic, all that stuff. So for that reason, I'm gonna put this. I want to put this at the D tier, but I also want to put this at the C tier. So I'll put it at the C tier because it obviously was hated by the fans and was thought to be the worst one of the entire trilogy. But that title respectfully goes to The Last Jedi for obvious reasons, of course. And I would say that
Okay.
had it not been for The Last Jedi, then The Rise of Skywalker would not have failed. So,
Right.
obviously, the stakes were pretty high and the bar was pretty set high for The Rise of Skywalker. So, I've maybe being a little bit too gracious for this, but this is okay.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Michael, for sharing your list. So I'm going to take yours down and
Hmm.
then we're going to share mine. All right. So I'm going to do mine by chronological order instead of you doing yours in order of release. So I'm going to start with Phantom Menace. And for me, Phantom Menace is going to go in the A tier. This one gets major points because this was the first Star Wars movie I ever saw. This was the one that got me hooked into Star Wars. But what ultimately keeps it from S tier for me is the flaws that it has. Jar Jar Binks does get pretty annoying. Um, Jake Lloyd, as you said, did his best, but even still, doing your best sometimes doesn't always work out. And so for those reasons, it goes into the A tier, but it gets as high as the A tier because I love Liam Neeson as Qui-Gon. I love Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan.
33
I
years.
really love what was that?
My phone was just going off. Sorry.
Oh, it's fine. I absolutely love Ian McDermott as Palpatine and Ray Park as Darth Maul. And Darth Maul's lightsaber is hands down my favorite lightsaber in all of Star Wars. So moving on, we're going to go to Attack of the Clones, and I'm going to put this one in C tier. And I'm putting this one in C tier because I do want to say real quick, I do not hate any of these movies, but for me, Attack of the Clones, by comparison, is one of the more boring Star Wars movies because with a few small exceptions peppered throughout the movie, most of the movie is just people sitting around talking. be it Anakin and Padme sitting around talking on the on Naboo having dinner or at the fireplace, or Obi-Wan talking to the Kaminoans. And you've got to wait pretty much until like the last quarter of the movie to get some good action from pretty much the droid factory scene to the end. So for that reason, it's going to go in C tier, though though it has nothing to do with the acting. I think the acting was good, if not the writing was pretty cringe. Next is Revenge of the Sith, and this one's going to S tier. It's going to S tier because, yes, it did have the cringe writing like Attack of the Clones did, but not quite as much. But the action in this one, for me, just completely outshined all the other Star Wars movies. Especially, pretty much alone by the Obi-Wan versus Anakin fight. That's like one of the best lightsaber fights in all of Star Wars. Even if I do personally prefer Luke versus Vader in Episode 6, this is like one of the best from a pure action standpoint. Not to mention Hayden Christensen improves his performance as Anakin. So does Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan, Ian McDiarmid as Palpatine. Just everyone gives their absolute all with this movie. After this, we're going to go with Rogue One. And Rogue One, I'm going to go B tier. I believe that this is the best of the Disney Star Wars movies. And I agree with what you have said, Michael, where this is probably one of the most diverse main casts, but it works because everyone has a part to play, even if it's a little part. Even though it's sad that everyone dies at the end, they kind of had to because they weren't in A New Hope. But this is like the closest thing we've gotten to a Disney Star Wars movie feeling like it's something that George Lucas could have made, especially with everything involving Vader. I just realized I got Rogue One and Solo swapped. I should have done Solo, but I'm going to go ahead and do Solo now. Solo is going to go D tier because basically I think this movie was unnecessary. It was okay for what we got, but personally, I really did not need to know that much about Han Solo. We could have just had Han Solo be introduced in A New Hope and let our imagination fill in the rest. But that being said, what we got was okay, even if I do agree with you that L3 was absolutely annoying. Having a droid, want droid rights is an okay gimmick unto itself, but if that's all you're talking about, it's like, come on, just shut up already. So for that, and you know, it's just gonna be D tier for me. Next is gonna be A New Hope. A New Hope, I'm gonna put in B tier for pretty much the same reason that I put Attack of the Clones in C tier, because this one, compared to the other to the other two in the original trilogy, is probably the most boring out of the original trilogy. And that's not to say that it's bad at all. You could just tell that Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi improved off of what A New Hope started. But that being said, there are plenty that I like in this movie. I like seeing Alec Guinness as Obi-Wan. I thought Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher did a great job as Luke, Han, and Leia, respectively, even if, the whole power converters line was pretty cringe. It wasn't as bad as you said, Michael. I don't like sand. And I agree with you also that compared to other lightsaber fights, this one was kind of lackluster. But again, it was also the first Star Wars lightsaber fight, and they really weren't sure yet how it was going to look. So, of course, there's going to be an evolution as the series goes on. So, moving on now to Empire Strikes Back, this one's going to go in S tier. Because this, I would say, in fact, I'm going to switch Empire and Revenge of the Sith for this one. And I'm going to do the same for Rogue One and A New Hope. So how I'm doing it is the closer they are to the letter, the higher up within the tier they're ranked. So I'm putting Empire before Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope before Rogue One, though this could be debatable for me. But I'm putting Empire above Revenge of the Sith because This is probably the closest to a perfect Star Wars movie as we would ever get. No cringe writing, no bad effects. In fact, I think if I remember correctly, this is like one of the least altered movies when they made the special editions. Um, the lightsaber fight in this, even if it's not my favorite, it is still, I'd say it's probably my second or third favorite lightsaber
Yeah.
fight. Um, Darth Vader is at his best in this movie. It was cool to see Han and Leia's relationship continue. It's cool to meet Lando for the first time. And then, of course, the big reveal, Luke, I am your father. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, I want
And
to
then,
say that in regards to Empire being altered, the only thing I can remember at the least, other than of course the Wampa scene, was also the fact that Boba Fett was voiced by Tamir Morrison.
which that's
Because
one, which that's one change I prefer.
yes,
Yeah. All right. And then moving on to Return of the Jedi. Return of the Jedi, I'm going to go A because even because even it is my second favorite of the original trilogy, but what's keeping it from an S tier for me, even though I love everything involving Luke, Vader, and the Emperor at the end of the movie, I just do not. I'm not the biggest fan of everything to do with Jabba's palace. I think that whole sequence overstayed its welcome, especially in regards to the big dance number that you mentioned, Michael. I don't care whether or not it's the original version or the updated CGI version. I don't like either version. And ultimately, what point did they serve other than teasing the Rancor, which we could have kept a complete surprise until Luke was dropped down into the Rancor's pit? But that's ultimately what's keeping it from S tier for me. Finally, the sequel trilogy. The Force Awakens, I'm going to go C tier because I would say this is probably like the best well made of the sequel trilogy because The Last Jedi, spoiler alert, F tier, and then of course Rise of Skywalker is left to pick up the pieces. But The Force Awakens was like a great setup that unfortunately was not paid off very well in The Last Jedi. I think they set up a bunch of good mysteries with who's Rey related to, who is Snoke, how is Rey able to use the Force, etc., etc. But I also agree that they played it way too safe by basically making it a rehash of A New Hope. And then The Last Jedi, F tier. And Last Jedi is an F tier for three big reasons. Number one, Luke Skywalker and the way that they treated him. I've already ranted about this in my Last Jedi review. So if you want to know my thoughts on that, just go watch that video. Number two, it has Vice Admiral Holdo in it, and she is hands down my least favorite Star Wars character because she's unnecessarily a jerk to Poe. Again, yes, he screwed up that one mission, but he's still an important member of the Resistance, and you should still treat him like so. And number three, the entire chase between the rebels and the resistance and the First Order is completely stupid and it throws physics out the window. If you want to know more details, just go watch my Last Jedi review. And then finally, Rise of Skywalker. I'm going to put this one in C tier also because I can certainly admire and respect that JJ at least tried to fix the problems that The Last Jedi created, but ultimately it created more of a mess. I like the idea that I liked how they made Rey. Well, I liked how they at least gave an explanation this time around for why Rey is so powerful because she has Palpatine blood. Um, I liked that Palpatine came back, and it was cool seeing Ian McDermott in that role. Though, let's be honest, they only did that because Snoke got killed off in The Last Jedi. And again, I think the way that Palpatine went out is completely stupid. But aside from that, it is my favorite of the sequel trilogy. So this pretty much is my tier list right here. So I'm curious in the comments, what would you guys rank the movies at. And it doesn't have to be a tier list. You could just rank them worst to best. I just chose tier list because of this program. So Michael, do you have anything last to say before we sign off?
I really don't have anything else. You pretty much hit the nail on the head, you can say.
Okay. All right, then I think that's a good place to end the video. So again, thank you for watching everything. Please hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we will see you in our next video. Thank